For 35 years, I have been the ghost in the corners of this limestone mansion, the woman who mends socks and clips grocery coupons while my husband, Arthur, toasts to his empire. To Arthur and our children, I am the bankrupt housewife, a woman without a penny of her own, a burden tethered to their soaring success. I have watched them look through me, heard them whisper about my lack of ambition over vintage wine I supposedly couldn't afford. But empires are often built on secrets, and mine is the foundation they are standing on. I need to know what happened. I need to understand why a mother would let her own blood believe she was nothing, only to watch them dismantle their own lives with their arrogance. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, subscribe and stay with me. This is not a story of a woman who lost everything, but a woman who realized she was the only thing holding it all up. What happens when the person you've mocked for decades is the only person who can save you? The smell of expensive coffee and cold indifference always filled the breakfast nook at 7 a.m. It was a room designed by Chloe, all white marble and brushed gold, that felt more like a gallery than a home. I sat at the far end of the table, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea I'd had since the 80s. It was the only thing in this house that felt like it belonged to me. Arthur was staring at his tablet, his brow furrowed in that way that signaled he wanted everyone to know how heavy the world felt on his shoulders. He didn't look up when I placed his poached eggs in front of him. He never did. "The merger with Sterling is hitting a snag," Arthur muttered, more to the room than to me. "Their board is asking for a deeper audit of our liquidity. Idiots. They don't realize who they're dealing with." "I'm sure it will be fine, Arthur," I said softly. My voice was a practiced instrument. Level, non-threatening, almost bland. He finally looked at me, but his eyes didn't settle on my face. They settled on my cardigan, a gray wool piece that had seen better days. "Elena, for God's sake, could you at least pretend to have some dignity while the help is in the house? That rag belongs in a donation bin. But I suppose you wouldn't know quality if it bit you. You've always had a bankrupt soul." I felt the familiar sting, a dull ache I'd learned to compartmentalize decades ago. I didn't flinch. "It's comfortable," I replied. "Comfortable," Chloe echoed as she swept into the room, her heels clicking like a metronome against the marble. She was dressed in a $3,000 suit, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She didn't kiss my cheek. She sat down and immediately began scrolling through her phone. "Mother, comfort is for people who have given up. Honestly, Dad, I don't know how you do it. If I had to look at that every morning, I'd lose my drive." Julian followed her, his eyes red-rimmed from whatever networking event he'd attended the night before. He slumped into a chair and shoved his plate toward me. "Eggs, Mom. Hard. And I need $5,000 moved into my checking by noon. The new app launch is burning through the initial seed faster than expected." Arthur sighed, a theatrical sound. "You heard him, Elena. Check the household ledger. If we're short, take it out of your personal allowance. Not like you're spending it on anything worthwhile." I looked at Julian, who was already staring at his phone, then at Arthur, who had returned to his empire. They talked about money as if it were air, something they were naturally entitled to breathe, something I was merely allowed to exhale. They didn't know that the household ledger they scoffed at was a rounding error in the accounts I managed from a laptop they thought I used for recipes. "I'll see what I can do," I said. "See what you can do?" Julian laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "It's Dad's money, Mom. Just click the buttons. It's the only job you have." I stood up and began clearing the table. My movements were slow, deliberate. I took Arthur's empty plate, Chloe's half-eaten avocado toast, and Julian's discarded napkins. I was the cleaning crew, the accountant, the silent witness. In the kitchen, the silence was a relief. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes. For years, I had maintained this charade. When Arthur's father had died 30 years ago, he'd left the company in a shambles, a secret Arthur still didn't know. It was my inheritance, a quiet windfall from my own grandmother's estate that had infused Vance Logistics with the capital it needed to survive the 80s. I had funneled it through a series of holding companies, masked as private investors, to protect Arthur's ego. I had wanted him to feel like the man he pretended to be. I had thought, back then, that love meant being the wind beneath someone's wings. I didn't realize that some people, when they fly high enough, forget the wind ever existed. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from Silas Thorne. The Sterling board has completed the background check on the parent company, Elena. They know Vance Logistics is 80% owned by Crestwood Holdings. They are demanding a meeting with the principal before the merger can proceed. Arthur is spiraling. How do you want to play this? I looked through the kitchen doorway. Arthur was standing in the foyer, shouting at his reflection as he adjusted his silk tie. Chloe was complaining to him about the embarrassment of my old station wagon parked in the driveway. Julian was shouting into his phone about disrupting the market. They were so loud, so certain of their place in the world. I looked back at my phone and typed a short reply to Silas. Let him spiral for a few days. I want to see how he treats the bankrupt housewife when he thinks his empire is burning. I put the phone away and picked up a sponge. I had a kitchen to clean. I had a role to play. And for the first time in 30 years, I was beginning to wonder what would happen if I simply stopped playing it. That evening, the air in the house was thick with Arthur's panic. He had returned home 3 hours early, his face a pale shade of gray. He didn't call for a drink. He didn't bark orders. He went straight to his study and slammed the door. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of glass breaking. I walked to the study door and knocked softly. Arthur? Is everything all right? Go away, Elena! He screamed from behind the wood. You wouldn't understand. It's business, real business, not your grocery lists and your nickel and diming. The world is ending, and you're probably wondering if the chicken is on sale. I stood in the hallway, the cool wood of the floor beneath my feet. I didn't feel hurt. I felt a strange, cold clarity. He was right. I didn't understand the business he thought he owned. I understood the one that actually existed. I walked away from the door, leaving him alone with his shattering ego. I went to my small, cramped sewing room at the back of the house, the only room that didn't feel like a showroom, and sat at my desk. I opened my laptop and logged into the Crestwood portal. The numbers were there, cold and staggering. 800 million in liquid assets, controlling interest in 3 logistics firms, 2 tech giants, and the very ground this house sat on. I looked at a photo on my desk. It was from our 10th anniversary. Arthur was smiling, looking at the camera with a predatory kind of joy. I was looking at him, my expression one of pure, unadulterated devotion. I reached out and turned the photo face down. Tomorrow, Arthur would have to face the Sterling board. Tomorrow, he would find out that the anonymous principal of Crestwood Holdings had requested a private seat at the negotiation table. He still thought I was his liability. He had no idea I was his landlord. The sun didn't so much rise the next morning as it did intrude, casting long, accusing fingers of light across the plush cream carpets of our bedroom. Arthur had been up since 4. I knew this because I had lain perfectly still, matching my breathing to the rhythm of sleep while he paced the length of the suite, his footsteps heavy and uneven. When I finally entered the kitchen at 6:30, the air was already vibrating with his agitation. He was standing by the center island, 3 different phones spread out before him, like a general surveying a losing battlefield. He looked haggard. The skin beneath his eyes was the color of a bruised plum, and his expensive silk shirt was tucked in haphazardly. "The coffee is cold," he snapped, not looking up as I moved toward the stove. "I'll make a fresh pot, Arthur," I said. My voice was the softest thing in the room, a contrast to the sharp, metallic clinking of his cufflinks as he tapped them against the granite. "Don't bother with the cheap beans you usually buy to save pennies," he sneered, finally looking at me. His eyes were bloodshot. "The Sterling representatives are coming by the office today. I need to be sharp. I can't have my brain fogged by your discount store swill. Go to the Italian market, get the reserve roast, and for God's sake, Elena, wear something that doesn't make you look like you're about to scrub a floor. If Silas Thorne sees you looking like a vagrant, it reflects poorly on my management." I paused, my hand on the handle of the kettle. "Silas Thorne is coming today?" "He's the lead counsel for the Crestwood Group," Arthur barked, waving a hand dismissively. "The principal is sending him to oversee the audit. It's a formality, but a high-stakes one. These are people who deal in billions, Elena. They don't understand your world of coupons and generic brand aspirin. They understand power. They understand me." I turned back to the stove, a small, bitter smile playing at the corners of my mouth where he couldn't see it. It was fascinating, in a clinical sort of way, to watch a man brag about his power while standing on a trapdoor I held the lever to. "I'll get the coffee," I said quietly. By 10 o'clock, the house had shifted from a home into a staging ground. Chloe arrived shortly after Arthur left, her presence announced by the aggressive scent of her designer perfume. She didn't come to check on me. She came because she needed a neutral space to host a client meeting, and apparently her own high-rise loft wasn't stately enough. I was in the pantry, organizing cans by expiration date, a task that kept my hands busy while my mind ran through the Crestwood portfolio when she walked in. "Mom, did you move my architectural portfolios, the ones I left in the foyer?" I stepped out of the pantry. "I moved them to the study, Chloe. I didn't want the dogs to get to them." She let out a sharp, theatrical breath. "In the study? Do you have any idea how heavy those are? I have a client coming in 20 minutes. I don't have time to be hauling dead weight because you have some obsession with tidiness." She looked me up and down, her lip curling slightly. "And what are you wearing? Is that one of Dad's old shirts?" "It's comfortable for cleaning," I said. "You have a maid, Mother. Use her. Or better yet, go out for the afternoon. My client is the wife of a venture capitalist. I can't have her seeing you like this. It ruins the brand. Just tell her you're the housekeeper if you run into her. It'll be less explaining for me." She turned on her heel and marched toward the study. I stood in the hallway, the silence of the house settling over me like dust. The housekeeper. It wasn't the first time she'd suggested it. To Chloe, I was a functional necessity that had outlived its aesthetic value. I was the person who ensured the linens were bleached and the fridge was full, but I was a ghost at the dinner table of her life. I walked to the foyer and picked up my car keys. I didn't go to the Italian market for Arthur's coffee. Instead, I drove my rusted 10-year-old station wagon to a nondescript office park 3 towns over. Silas was waiting for me in a private conference room that smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. He rose as I entered, his expression one of deep, practiced respect. "Elena," he said, pulling out a chair for me, "you look tired." "I'm observant, Silas. There's a difference." I sat down and placed my worn leather handbag on the glass table. "Tell me about the audit." Silas sighed, leaning back. Arthur is desperate. He's been moving funds between the subsidiary accounts to mask the overhead of his personal spending. He's leveraged the Vance family estate, this house, Elena, against a bridge loan he took out 6 months ago to fund Julian's Alpha Tech venture. He didn't tell you, did he? I felt a coldness settle in my chest. He put the house up? He doesn't think he can lose, Silas said. He thinks the Sterling merger will provide enough liquidity to wash the slate clean. But the Sterling board is smart. They've noticed the Crestwood involvement. They want to know why a silent holding company has been subsidizing Vance Logistics for 3 decades without ever taking a dividend. And what did you tell them? I told them the principal is considering a change in leadership, Silas said, his eyes meeting mine. I told them the principal is unhappy with the current management's frivolous use of capital. I looked out the window at the gray afternoon sky. He thinks I'm a failure, Silas. He tells me every day. He thinks I'm a bankrupt housewife who can't balance a checkbook. He's out there risking the roof over my head to fund our son's fantasies, all while calling me a burden. What do you want to do? I want the meeting, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a scream. The one with the Sterling board, the one where the principal is revealed. But not yet. Not until Arthur thinks he's won. I want him to reach for the prize and find only air. I left the office and finally bought the coffee Arthur wanted. I drove home and placed it on the counter. That evening, dinner was a somber affair. Julian had joined us, looking triumphant. He was talking loudly about a new angel investor he'd met, unaware that the Angel was a shell company I controlled, designed to track exactly where his father's loans were going. "Once the Sterling deal closes, Dad," Julian said, stabbing a piece of roast beef, "we should look into the Pacific routes. I've got a guy who says we can undercut the competition by 40% if we lean out the staff." Arthur nodded, though his eyes were distant. "Lean is good. We need to be lean. We've been carrying too much dead weight for too long." He glanced at me, a pointed, ugly look. "In all areas of life." "Speaking of dead weight," Chloe said, sipping her wine, "Mom, I'm hosting a gallery opening next month. It's a big deal. I've already told the caterers not to contact you. I don't want you stressing over the menu and making it look homemade. I've hired a firm from the city." "I understand," I said. I took a bite of my dinner. It tasted like ash. "Don't look so pouty, Elena," Arthur said, his voice grating. "It's for the best. You've always been better suited for the background. Some people are born to lead, and some are born to serve. There's no shame in knowing your place." I set my fork down. The sound of the silver hitting the china seemed to echo in the room. "And what is my place, Arthur?" I asked. It was the first time in years I'd asked a direct question during dinner. The table went silent. Julian and Chloe looked at me as if the toaster had suddenly started speaking. Arthur let out a short, bark-like laugh. "Your place is exactly where you are," he said, gesturing to the house around us. "In a home you didn't pay for, eating food you didn't earn, protected by a name you'd have no right to if I hadn't given it to you. Now, clear the plates. I have a call with Silas in 10 minutes. I stood up. I gathered the plates. I felt the weight of their judgment, their collective belief in my insignificance. As I walked toward the kitchen, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A notification from the bank. Arthur had just attempted to transfer another $50,000 from the Household Emergency Fund into Julian's business account. I didn't block the transfer. Not yet. I wanted him to feel the warmth of the money before I turned the world cold. In the kitchen, I leaned against the sink and looked at the coffee bag I'd bought. Reserve roast. I opened the bag and poured the expensive beans directly into the garbage disposal. Then, I reached for the generic $2 bag I kept in the back of the pantry. He wanted to talk about dead weight? Tomorrow, the audit would move from the company's books to his personal assets. Tomorrow, Silas would ask for proof of the housewife's signature on the loan documents Arthur had forged to leverage our home. I wondered if Arthur knew the penalty for bank fraud. I wondered if he'd still think I belonged in the background when I was the only person who could keep him out of a cell. The generic coffee tasted like burnt wood and disappointment. Arthur spat his first sip back into the mug, the liquid splashing onto the pristine white marble island. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a rage that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with the walls closing in on him. "I told you to get the reserve roast. I gave you specific instructions, Elena. Is your mind so far gone that you can't even handle a grocery run?" I continued wiping the counter, my movements rhythmic and calm. "The Italian market was closed for a private event, Arthur. I had to make do." "You had to make do," he mimicked in a high, mocking tone. He slammed the mug down. "This is exactly why I can't trust you with anything of substance. You have no standard, no excellence. You're content with making do, while I am out there fighting to keep this family from drowning." I looked at the brown stain on the marble. I didn't offer to clean it. "Are we drowning, Arthur? I thought the Sterling merger was a guaranteed success." His eyes flickered, a brief, frantic spark of fear that he quickly masked with a scowl. "It is. But the audit is tedious. They're looking at everything, even the personal accounts, which is why I'm freezing the household card. From now on, any expense over $50 goes through me. I can't have you bleeding the accounts dry on craft supplies and overpriced organic produce while I'm trying to balance the books." I felt a cold ripple of amusement. He was freezing an account that held less than $3,000, while I had just moved $12 million into a high-yield offshore fund before breakfast. "I understand," I said softly. "I'll be more careful." "Good, because Chloe is bringing a client over for lunch, a big one, the wife of Marcus Sterling. If you can't manage to buy decent coffee, at least manage to stay out of the way. Stay in the kitchen. Make those little cucumber sandwiches Julian likes. At least you're good for something domestic." He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out without a second glance. He didn't notice that I hadn't looked at him once during the entire exchange. I was looking at the ledger in my mind, crossing off another line of respect I no longer held for him. By noon, the house was silent, except for the distant hum of the air conditioning. Chloe arrived with a woman who radiated the kind of quiet ancestral wealth that Chloe desperately tried to emulate, but never quite mastered. Mrs. Sterling was elegant, wearing a simple linen dress that cost more than my first car. Chloe didn't introduce me. She led the woman into the sunroom, gesturing toward the garden I had spent 20 years tending with my own 2 hands. "The grounds are a bit overgrown," Chloe apologized, her voice tinkling with fake embarrassment. "I've been telling Dad we need to hire a professional firm, but he's so sentimental about the old staff. He hates letting people go, even when they're past their prime." I stood in the kitchen, plating the sandwiches Arthur had ordered. I was the old staff. To my own daughter, I was a legacy hire that her father kept around out of pity. I walked into the sunroom with the tray. I wore my usual housewife uniform, a faded floral apron over a simple dress. I kept my head down, the perfect image of a woman who had no thoughts beyond the thickness of a cucumber slice. "Thank you, Elena," Chloe said. her voice dripping with a dismissive kindness that was worse than her father's shouting. "That will be all. We'll ring if we need more tea." Mrs. Sterling looked at me then, truly looked at me. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent. "Wait," she said, her voice low and melodic. "You look familiar. Have we met? Perhaps at the Botanical Gala last year?" Chloe let out a sharp, forced laugh. "Oh, no, Mrs. Sterling. My mother doesn't really do galas. She's much more of a homebody. She probably just has one of those faces." I offered a small, vacuous smile. "I'm just the one who keeps the house running, ma'am. I hope you enjoy the tea." As I turned to leave, I heard Mrs. Sterling murmur to Chloe, "She has very steady hands, your mother. Most people in her position would be nervous serving someone like me. There's a certain gravity to her." "It's just exhaustion," Chloe replied, her voice dropping to a whisper that still carried. "She's lived a very small life. Sometimes I think the sheer weight of doing nothing all day wears her out more than a real job would." I didn't stop. I walked back to the kitchen, set the empty tray on the counter, and leaned against the sink. A very small life. I thought about the night I had sat in this very kitchen 5 years ago and quietly authorized the buyout of the shipping lane that gave Arthur his biggest win. I had done it while he was upstairs sleeping, dreaming of a glory he hadn't earned. I had done it to protect him. I had done it because I thought a wife's job was to be the silent architect of her husband's monument. I looked at the clock. 1:30 p.m. The principal of Crestwood Holdings was scheduled to have a private call with Marcus Sterling at 2 p.m. I went to my sewing room and locked the door. I pulled an encrypted satellite phone from a hidden compartment in my sewing machine table. It rang once. "Elena?" Marcus Sterling's voice was warm. "I must say your daughter is quite charming, but she lacks your discretion. She spent the last hour trying to convince my wife that your husband is the sole genius behind Vance Logistics." "Let her believe it for now, Marcus," I said, my voice no longer soft or bland. It was a blade. "Did your auditors find the discrepancies I pointed them toward?" "They did," Marcus said, his tone turning serious. "Arthur has been embezzling from the employee pension fund to cover Julian's losses. And the home loan? Elena, he forged your signature. If this merger goes through, you'll be legally tied to a fraud case that could strip you of everything." "I know," I said. "That's why the merger isn't going through. Not as Arthur expects." "What are your instructions?" "Proceed with the audit," I said, watching a bird land on the bird feeder outside my window. The one Chloe thought was shabby. "Pressure him. Make him feel like the only way out is to surrender his personal shares to Crestwood. I want him to believe he's saving the family by giving up his power to a faceless corporation." "And the house?" "Let him believe he's lost it," I said. "I want to see where they go when they think they have nothing left. I want to see if they remember the woman who spent 30 years making sure they had everything." I hung up the phone and sat in the silence. That night, Julian came home in a state of panic. He didn't even say hello. He marched into the living room where Arthur was staring into a glass of scotch. "Dad, the angel pulled out," Julian shouted, his face flushed. "They did a clawback on the seed funding. They said my projections were fanciful. I'm down $300,000 by Friday or the servers get shut down." Arthur didn't even look at him. "Join the club, son. The auditors found the pension transfers. Silas says if I don't find a way to settle the balance, the board will call for a criminal investigation." "Well, do something," Julian yelled. "Sell the house. Use Mom's jewelry. She's got that diamond set from Grandma, doesn't she? It's just sitting in a box." Arthur finally looked up, his eyes hollow. "I already checked the safe, Julian. It's empty." They both turned their heads toward the kitchen doorway where I was standing, holding a basket of clean laundry. "Elena," Arthur said, his voice a low growl. "Where is the jewelry? The heirloom set. I need it. Now." I squeezed the wicker handles of the basket. "I sold it, Arthur. 3 months ago." The silence that followed was absolute. "You what?" Arthur whispered, rising slowly from his chair. "I sold it," I repeated, my voice steady, "to pay for the repairs on the station wagon and the grocery bills you said were too high. You told me to make do, so I did." Arthur's face went from pale to a deep, dangerous purple. "You sold a $100,000 heirloom to fix a rusted car? You stupid, insignificant woman! Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed us!" He lunged toward me, not to strike, but to grab my shoulders, to shake me into understanding his desperation. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I simply looked into his eyes with a coldness that stopped him in his tracks. "I haven't destroyed anything, Arthur," I said quietly. "I've just stopped building it for you." I turned and walked up the stairs, the weight of the laundry basket feeling lighter than it had in years. Behind me, I heard the sound of my husband breaking down into heaving, panicked sobs, and my son cursing the mother who had failed him. They didn't know that the jewelry was sitting in a private vault at the bank. I hadn't sold it for the car. I had sold it to myself, using a Crestwood subsidiary, just to see the look on Arthur's face when he realized he couldn't strip me of one more thing. The trap was set. And the beauty of it was, they were the ones who had built the cage. The house felt different the next morning, hollower, as if the walls were finally beginning to exhale the secrets they had held for decades. I woke up at my usual time, but for the first time in 35 years, I didn't go downstairs to start the breakfast. I stayed in bed, watching the dust motes dance in the light, listening to the muffled sounds of a house that didn't know how to function without its engine. I heard the frantic slamming of kitchen cabinets, the sharp beep of the microwave, and Arthur's voice, raw from lack of sleep, shouting Julian's name. I didn't move. I felt a strange, detached curiosity. How long would it take for them to notice that the ghost had stopped haunted the halls? When I finally descended around 9, the kitchen was a disaster. Crumbs littered the marble island, a half-empty carton of milk sat sweating on the counter, and the smell of burnt toast hung heavy in the air. Arthur was sitting at the table, his head in his hands. Chloe was there too, looking immaculate but vibrating with a suppressed fury. Julian was pacing by the window, his thumb flying across his phone screen. They all looked up when I entered. "Oh, look who decided to join us," Chloe said, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "Mother, do you have any idea what time it is? We've been waiting for hours. Dad has a meeting with the bank in 40 minutes, and he hasn't even had a proper meal." "The coffee is in the pantry, Chloe," I said, walking past them to pour myself a glass of water. "And the eggs are in the fridge. I assumed you all knew where the stove was." Arthur looked up, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a terrifying desperation. "Elena, enough with the games. We've been talking. About the jewelry, about your recent lapses in judgment." I took a slow sip of water. "Lapses?" "You sold the Vance family legacy to fix a car," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "That's not just making do, Elena. That's a sign of a mind that is no longer capable of managing its own affairs. I've spoken to Julian and Chloe. We think it's time we look into a power of attorney. For your protection." The psychological weight of the words was meant to crush me, to make me feel small and fragile. They weren't just trying to take my money. They were trying to take my agency, to label me unfit so they could pick the bones of whatever they thought I had left. "You want to take control of my life?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's for your own good, Mom," Julian chimed in, not looking up from his phone. "You clearly can't handle distress anymore. And let's be honest, you've always lived in Dad's shadow. It's easier this way. We'll handle the bills. You just garden, or whatever it is you do." "And the station wagon is going," Chloe added. "I've already called a scrap dealer." "It's an eyesore, and frankly, you shouldn't be driving anyway if you're this confused. I'll arrange for a car service if you need to go to the doctor." I looked at my children, the boy I had stayed up with through every fever, the girl whose every heartbreak I had mended with patience and silence. They were looking at me not as a mother, but as a problem to be solved, a liability to be liquidated. "I see," I said. I set the water glass down. "And what about the house, Arthur? Silas mentioned you leveraged it. If I sign this power of attorney, can you use my name to finalize that bridge loan?" Arthur stiffened. He didn't think I'd connected the dots. "It's a technicality, Elena. A way to bridge the gap until the Sterling deal. It's nothing for you to worry your head about." "I'm not worried," I said. And for the first time, I let a hint of the principal's steel leak into my expression. "I'm observant." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving them to their plans. I went to the garden. It was the only place where things grew because I nurtured them, not because I paid for them. I began to prune the rose bushes, the sharp snap of the shears the only sound in the quiet morning air. An hour later, I heard Arthur's car roar down the driveway. He was heading to the bank, likely with the forged documents Silas had told me about. He was going to try to save his empire by stealing the last thing he thought I owned: my name. Chloe came out to the terrace, a designer sunglasses case in her hand. She watched me for a moment, her arms crossed over her chest. "You're being very difficult, Mother," she said. "Dad is under a lot of pressure. The Sterling merger is the biggest thing to happen to this family in decades. If it fails, we lose everything. Do you understand that? The lifestyle, the connections, my business, it all goes away." "Your business, Chloe?" I asked, not looking up from a stubborn vine. "The one I gave you the startup capital for? The one I've been quietly paying the rent for through the Crestwood Grant program for the last 3 years?" Chloe froze. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face. "What are you talking about? I won that grant on merit. It was a national competition." I finally looked at her. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just gave her the truth, cold and unvarnished. "There was no competition, Chloe. I created that grant because your father told me you were a failure and he wouldn't waste another dime on your hobbies. I wanted you to believe in yourself. I wanted you to have something of your own." "You're lying," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're just trying to confuse me. You don't have that kind of money. You're a housewife. You're nothing." "If that's what you need to believe to sleep at night, then believe it," I said, turning back to the roses. "But ask yourself why the anonymous donor always knew exactly when your accounts were in the red." She backed away from me as if I were a stranger, a ghost that had suddenly developed a heartbeat. She didn't stay to argue. She ran back into the house, her heels clicking frantically on the stone. I felt a pang of sadness, a fleeting ghost of the mother I used to be. I had spent a lifetime protecting them from the truth of their own mediocrity, and in doing so, I had raised monsters who thought their privilege was a birthright rather than a gift. My phone buzzed. A message from Silas. Arthur is at the bank. He's presenting the forged signature now. The branch manager is a friend of mine. We have him on camera, Elena. This is the point of no return. If we move now, he goes to jail. If we wait, he loses the house. What is your command? I looked at the house. The limestone walls, the gold-flecked windows. The monument to a man who didn't exist. Inside, my daughter was questioning her entire reality, and my son was likely stealing from the liquor cabinet. I thought about the 35 years of bankrupt silences I had endured. I thought about the reserve roast coffee in the trash and the forged name on the loan. I typed back, "Let him sign. Let him think he's won. I want him to have exactly 1 hour of feeling like a king before the crown turns to lead." I put the phone away and picked up my shears. There was one more vine to prune. As I worked, I realized I wasn't just pruning the garden anymore. I was pruning my life. I was cutting away the dead weight, the parasitic growth that had been draining me dry for decades. It was painful, yes, but for the first time in a long time, I could see the sun. I heard a loud crash from inside the house, the sound of something expensive breaking, probably one of Chloe's vases. The silence was over. The withdrawal was complete. Now, the vacuum would begin to pull them in. Arthur returned home at 3 o'clock, his gait possessing a bounce that hadn't been there in weeks. He tossed his keys onto the marble sideboard, a sharp, metallic clatter that echoed through the foyer, and called out for a drink. He didn't look like a man who had just committed bank fraud. He looked like a man who had just conquered a small country. I was in the dining room, polishing the silver. It was a mindless task, the rhythmic friction of the cloth against the heavy forks providing a meditative hum to my thoughts. "Elena, get the good scotch," Arthur shouted, stepping into the room. He was loosening his tie, his face flushed with a manic sort of relief. "The bank approved the bridge loan. The house is secure, the payroll is covered, and the Sterling merger is back on the fast track." I didn't stop polishing. I didn't even look up. "That's a lot of paperwork to finish in one morning, Arthur. I imagine there were many signatures required." He stiffened for a fraction of a second, his fingers pausing at his collar. "Standard procedure. I had Silas expedite the filings. It's handled. That's all you need to know." He walked over to me, and for the first time in months, he placed a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy, like a lead weight. "I'm feeling generous, Elena. I know I was sharp with you about the jewelry. Let's put it behind us. I've decided not to move forward with the power of attorney, for now. As long as you stay out of the way and keep the household running smoothly, we can pretend your little episode never happened." His generosity was a bribe. He had used my name to save his skin, and now he was offering me the privilege of remaining his silent servant as payment. He thought he had bought my silence with the very roof he had stolen from under me. "How kind of you," I murmured. "It is, isn't it?" He patted my shoulder and headed toward his study. "Tell Chloe and Julian we're going out for a celebratory dinner tonight. Somewhere expensive. We need to look like a family that's winning." I watched him go. He had no idea that Silas had already sent the high-resolution stills from the bank's security feed to my private server. I could see the exact moment Arthur's pen touched the paper, the moment he forged the loopy E of my signature with the practiced ease of a career criminal. An hour later, Chloe came downstairs. She had changed into a silk slip dress, but her eyes were red-rimmed. She avoided looking at me, moving to the bar to pour herself a glass of wine. "Your father wants to go out for dinner," I said. "I'm not hungry," she snapped, her hand trembling as she held the decanter. She finally looked at me, her gaze darting to my face and then away. "That thing you said earlier, about the grant. It was a lie. It had to be. Dad said you're becoming delusional." "Did he?" I set the silver polish down. "Then why are you shaking, Chloe? If I'm just a delusional housewife, why does the truth feel so heavy?" "Because you're ruining everything!" she burst out, her voice cracking. "We were fine. We had a life. Why can't you just be the person you've always been? Why do you have to start saying these things now, when everything is so fragile?" "Because the person I've always been was a fiction created for your comfort," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the motherly warmth she was used to weaponizing against me. "I was the floor you walked on, Chloe. You never noticed the floor until it started to shift." She looked at me with a mixture of fear and loathing, the look a child gives a monster they've just realized lives under their bed. She didn't want the truth. She wanted her comfortable lie back. She wanted the mother who didn't have a voice, because a mother with a voice might demand a daughter with a conscience. Julian arrived shortly after, oblivious to the tectonic plates shifting beneath the family. He was on a high, having heard from Arthur that the liquidity crisis was over. "$5 grand, Mom," he said, walking into the kitchen and opening the fridge. "Dad said the bridge loan cleared. I need it for the server migration. Just move it from the miscellaneous fund." I stood at the sink, washing the silver polish from my hands. "No." Julian paused, a cold slice of pizza halfway to his mouth. "What?" "No, Julian. I'm not moving any more money. Not for your servers, not for your lifestyle. The miscellaneous fund is closed." He laughed, a genuine, confused sound. "Mom, it's not your money to close. It's Dad's. He told me to ask you. Just do the thing on the computer." "If it's your father's money, Julian, then ask him to do the thing himself. I'm sure he has the passwords." Of course, Arthur didn't have the passwords. I had set up the two-factor authentication to ping my private phone. For 30 years, I had acted as the manual interface for the family's finances, so they would never have to learn how the machinery worked. Julian's face darkened. "Are you having another episode? Dad said you were acting weird." "Don't make me get him, Mom. He's in a good mood. Don't ruin it." "Go get him, Julian," I said, drying my hands. "I'd love to have this conversation with all of you." The celebratory dinner didn't happen. Instead, we ended up in the living room, the four of us. The air was thick with a tension so palpable it felt like a physical weight. Arthur was standing by the fireplace, his face a mask of controlled fury. Chloe sat on the edge of the sofa, hugging herself. Julian paced like a caged animal. "Elena," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. "Julian tells me you're refusing to process the business transfers. We discussed this. Your job is to manage the ledgers I give you, nothing more." "I can't manage a ledger that is built on a felony, Arthur," I said. The silence that followed was so absolute, I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "What are you talking about?" Arthur whispered. "The bridge loan," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "I called the bank, Arthur. I told them I didn't remember signing any documents this morning. They were very helpful. They mentioned they have a very sophisticated security system in the signing room." Arthur's face went a shade of gray I didn't know was possible for a living human. He lunged forward, grabbing the back of a chair to steady himself. "You did what? You called the bank? You told them—" "Elena, do you have any idea what you've done? You've just triggered a fraud alert on our own home." "No," I corrected him. "I triggered a fraud alert on your signature. I haven't done anything. You're the one who signed my name." "I did it for us," he roared, the mask finally shattering. To save this family, to save this house. You were too small-minded to see the big picture, so I had to take charge. That's what a man does. He protects his own. By stealing from his wife? I asked. You have nothing to steal, he screamed. Everything you have, I gave you. This house, those clothes, the very air you breathe is subsidized by Vance Logistics. My phone rang. The ringtone was sharp, a piercing sound in the middle of his tirade. I pulled it from my pocket. It wasn't Silas. It was Marcus Sterling. I put it on speaker. Elena? Marcus's voice was clear and professional. I'm at the office with the board. We've just received a notification from the bank regarding a fraud investigation into Arthur Vance. Given our pending merger, we've decided to move the final meeting up. We need to meet with the principal of Crestwood Holdings tonight to discuss the immediate termination of Arthur's CEO contract. Arthur froze. Julian stopped pacing. Chloe let out a small, whimpering sound. I understand, Marcus, I said, my voice steady. I'll be there in an hour. Please have the security team ready to escort the current management out of the building. I hung up the phone. Arthur was staring at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The principal. Crestwood. Marcus was talking to you? He was talking to the woman who owns your company, Arthur, I said. I stood up and walked toward the stairs. I suggest you start packing. Chloe, you might want to look into the lease on your studio. I believe the anonymous grant has just been revoked. I reached the bottom step and paused, looking back at the three of them. The husband who had forged my soul, the daughter who had mocked my existence, and the son who had treated me like a machine. You always called me a bankrupt housewife, I said softly. But it turns out you were the ones living on credit. And the bill has finally come due. I walked up the stairs, leaving them in the wreckage of a reality that no longer existed. But as I reached my room, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, not of regret, but of a terrifying, hollowed-out exhaustion. I had won. But as I looked around my room, I realized I had spent 30 years building a palace for people who didn't even know my name. What happens to a ghost when the house finally falls down? The silence that followed my ascent was not the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, pressurized silence that precedes a structural collapse. I could hear them down there. The low, frantic murmurs of three people trying to rewrite a reality that had just been incinerated. I went to my closet. For years, this space had been filled with the sensible, muted tones of a woman who didn't want to be noticed. Beige cardigans, floral skirts, and the sturdy, unglamorous shoes of someone who spent her life on her feet. But behind a row of winter coats sat a locked, cedar-lined garment bag I hadn't opened in years. I unzipped it. Inside was a charcoal gray power suit, tailored with a precision that bordered on the lethal. Beside it sat a pair of black leather pumps, the heels like daggers. I stripped off my floral apron, the uniform of the bankrupt housewife, and let it fall to the floor in a heap. As I dressed, I heard a tentative knock on my door. It wasn't the aggressive pound of Arthur's fist. It was light, hesitant. Mom? It was Chloe. I didn't answer. I sat at my vanity and looked at my face. I hadn't worn makeup in years, save for a bit of lipstick for church. Now, I applied a dark, matte shadow to my eyes,
sharpening the gaze that had spent decades looking at grocery receipts. The door creaked open. Chloe stood in the reflection of my mirror, her face pale, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for the mother she knew. She saw the suit. She saw the shoes. "What is this?" she whispered. "The phone call. The bank? Dad says you've been planning this. He says you've been funneling money away from him for years. He says you're a thief."
I didn't turn around. I picked up a silver comb and ran it through my hair, pinning it back into a tight, severe bun. "A thief, Chloe? To steal, one must take something that belongs to another. Your father never owned the money that built his empire. He was a steward who mistook a loan for a gift." "He's your husband!" she cried, her voice rising in a desperate, shrill arc. "We're your family! How could you sit there every night and watch us struggle, knowing you had all this? You let me think I was failing. You let me beg for that grant." "I didn't let you think you were failing, Chloe. I let you face the reality of your own work. And when you couldn't make it, I caught you. Secretly. Silently. I gave you a safety net you didn't even have the grace to wonder about. You called me an embarrassment. You told your clients I was the help." "I was trying to build something," she screamed. "In this world, image is everything. You wouldn't understand that." I stood up and finally faced her. I was 3 inches taller in the heels, but it felt like miles. "I understand image perfectly, Chloe. I've spent 30 years maintaining yours, but an image is a shadow, and the sun is finally moving." I walked past her, my silk trousers whispering against each other. She reached out to grab my arm, but I sidestepped her with a fluid grace that seemed to shock her. I wasn't the clumsy woman who tripped over the rug anymore. In the hallway, I ran into Julian. He was leaning against the wall, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked at my suit, then at my face, and for the first time in his life, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He wasn't looking at his mother. He was looking at the person who held his debt. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Are you really the one behind Crestwood?" "The server migration was supposed to happen tomorrow, wasn't it, Julian?" I asked calmly. "You needed that 5,000. I wonder, if the servers stay dark, how many of your investors will realize your app is just a collection of stolen code and empty promises?" Julian's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. The liquid soaked into the rug, a rug I had chosen, paid for, and cleaned 1,000 times. "Mom, please," he stammered. "I'll pay it back. I just need a little more time. Don't do this. Not to your own son." "I'm not doing anything to you, Julian," I said, stepping over the broken glass. "I'm simply stepping out of the way. Let's see how well you run when the wind stops blowing." I reached the top of the stairs. Arthur was standing at the bottom, his hands gripped white-knuckled around the banister. He had tried to fix his tie, but it was crooked. He looked small. The limestone foyer, the soaring ceilings, the gold leaf, it all seemed to dwarf him now, as if the house itself recognized its true owner. "You aren't leaving this house, Elena," he said, his voice a ragged attempt at authority. "I've called the police. I've told them you've suffered a mental break and that you've stolen sensitive corporate data. You won't make it to that meeting." I descended the stairs slowly, my eyes locked on his. "The police are already on their way, Arthur. But not for me. Silas Thorne has already delivered the video of your visit to the bank this morning to the district attorney, along with the records of the pension fund transfers you made to Julian's accounts." Arthur's knees buckled. He sank onto the bottom step, the very picture of a man who had realized the trap was his own design. "Why?" he wheezed. 35 years. Why now?" I reached the bottom step and stood over him. I could smell the scotch on his breath, the scent of a man who had used arrogance as a shield against his own incompetence. "Because this morning, you told me I had a bankrupt soul," I said softly. "And I realized that, as long as I was the foundation of this house, I was the one being buried alive. I decided I wanted to see the sky. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, a low, rhythmic pulse that grew louder with every heartbeat. Arthur looked at the door, then at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic animal panic. "Elena, wait," he pleaded, reaching for the hem of my jacket. "We can fix this. I'll apologize. I'll make it right. Just tell Silas to stop. Tell Sterling it was a mistake." I looked down at his hand, the hand that had signed my name to a lie, and I gently uncoupled his fingers from my sleeve. The thing about a bankrupt soul, Arthur, is that you can't borrow your way out of it. I walked to the front door and opened it. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of rain and freedom. I didn't look back at the children standing on the landing or the husband weeping on the stairs. I walked down the driveway toward the waiting black sedan Silas had sent. As the driver opened the door, I looked back at the mansion. The lights were all on, every window glowing like an ember. It looked beautiful. It looked like a palace. And for the first time in 30 years, I didn't care if it burned to the ground. As the car pulled away, my phone buzzed. A message from Marcus Sterling. "The board is assembled. They're waiting for the principal." I leaned back against the cool leather seat and closed my eyes. The bankrupt housewife was dead. I wondered if they would even recognize the woman who walked into that boardroom. I wondered if I would recognize her myself. The interior of the black sedan was a sanctuary of hushed leather and tinted glass. Silas sat across from me, his tablet glowing in the dim light. He didn't speak for the first 5 minutes. He knew the weight of the silence I had lived in, and he knew that tonight, that silence was finally being weaponized. "Arthur's phone has been ringing incessantly," Silas said, his voice a calm anchor. "He's tried calling me 22 times. He's also tried to access the Crestwood Emergency Liquidity Fund. He doesn't realize that his biometric access was scrubbed the moment you stepped over the threshold of the front door." I looked out the window at the city lights. They blurred into long golden streaks. "He's desperate, Silas. A desperate man is a predictable man. He'll try to spin a story to the board. He'll say I've manipulated him or that I'm mentally unstable." "Let him," Silas replied. "The beauty of a paper trail is that it doesn't have feelings. It doesn't get confused. The signatures on the pension fund transfers are tied to his private IP address. The bank forgery is caught on 4K video. He can tell any story he wants, but the ending is already written." We pulled up to the Sterling Plaza, a monolith of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the underbelly of the clouds. As I stepped out of the car, the doorman, a man who had likely seen 1,000 titans of industry, bowed his head slightly. He didn't see a housewife. He saw the charcoal suit, the sharp bun, and the eyes of a woman who had stopped asking for permission. The elevator ride to the top floor was a silent ascent. I watched the numbers climb, my heart steady. I thought about the thousands of times I had waited for Arthur to come home, sitting in the dark kitchen, wondering if he was angry or tired or simply indifferent. I had spent so much of my life waiting for him to define the temperature of the room. The doors opened to a reception area that looked out over the entire city. Marcus Sterling was standing there, his hands deep in his pockets. When he saw me, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to profound realization. "Elena," he said, stepping forward. He didn't offer a handshake. He offered a nod of genuine respect. "You look different." "I look like myself, Marcus," I said. "The version you saw earlier was a courtesy I no longer feel like extending." "The board is through those doors," Marcus said, lowering his voice. "They're agitated." Arthur has been calling them individually, claiming there's been a security breach and that the principal has been compromised. He's trying to stall the merger vote. Then let's not keep them waiting, I said. I walked toward the double mahogany doors. Silas opened them for me, and I stepped into the boardroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and anxiety. 12 men and women sat around a glass table that seemed to stretch for miles. At the far end, on a large screen, was a live feed of Arthur. He was in his study, his face frantic, his hair disheveled. He was shouting into a microphone, his voice echoing through the boardroom speakers. "A complete fabrication. My wife has had a nervous breakdown. She's been institutionalized in the past for delusions. This Crestwood entity is a shell being used by a rival firm to dismantle Vance Logistics. I demand an immediate stay of—" He stopped mid-sentence. The camera on his end must have shown him the wide-angle view of the boardroom. He saw me. The silence that followed was more deafening than his shouting. On the screen, I watched Arthur's face go through a grotesque transformation. Confusion, then recognition, then a horrifying, bone-deep terror. I walked to the head of the table. I didn't sit down. I placed my hands on the cool glass and looked at the board members. "My name is Elena Vance," I said. My voice was low, but it filled every corner of the room. "I am the sole owner of Crestwood Holdings. For 30 years, I have been the silent majority shareholder of Vance Logistics. I am also the person who has been quietly fixing the systemic failures of the man currently screaming on your screen." One of the board members, a silver-haired man named Henderson, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Vance, Elena, this is highly irregular. Arthur claims you have no financial standing. He claims you are, well, a dependent." "Arthur claims a lot of things," I said, glancing at the screen. Arthur was frozen, staring at me as if I were a ghost that had just walked through a wall. "He claims he built an empire, but as you'll see in the folders Silas is distributing, the empire was insolvent in 1994, 2008, and again last year. Each time, Crestwood injected the capital necessary to keep the lights on. Not as a gift to Arthur, but as an investment in the thousands of employees whose livelihoods he was gambling away." I looked back at the screen. "Arthur, can you hear me?" He swallowed hard. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. "The board is about to vote on your removal as CEO," I said. "And as the principal of Crestwood, I am exercising my right to veto any merger that includes your continued involvement. I am also calling in the personal loans I made to the Vance family estate, the house, the cars, and the various shell companies you set up for Julian's ventures." "Elena, please," Arthur finally managed to whisper. The speakers picked it up, a pathetic, tinny sound. "You're destroying our children's future." "No, Arthur," I said, leaning closer to the microphone. "I am giving them exactly what they've earned. Chloe will have to design for a living instead of for status. Julian will have to learn what work actually looks like, and you will finally have to learn how to be a bankrupt man." I turned to the board. "The vote, please." It was unanimous. In less than 10 minutes, the world Arthur had spent a lifetime pretending to own was stripped from him. The merger with Sterling would proceed, but under new terms that placed me as the chairperson of the new conglomerate. As the board members filed out, offering their congratulations and their business cards, I stayed in my seat. I looked at the screen. The connection to Arthur's study was still active. He was sitting in his chair, his head bowed. He looked like a discarded doll. "Are you still there, Arthur?" I asked. He looked up. His eyes were hollow. "Where am I supposed to go, Elena? You've taken everything." "I've taken nothing," I said. "I've simply stopped giving. There's a difference. The police will be there in 20 minutes for the bank documents. I've instructed the staff to pack a single suitcase for you. It's waiting by the back door, the door the help uses." I signaled to Silas to cut the feed. The screen went black. I sat in the multi-million-dollar silence of the boardroom. My hands were still steady. My heart was still calm. But as Marcus Sterling walked back in with 2 glasses of water, I felt a sudden, sharp realization. I had won the war. I had dismantled the structure of my own life to save myself from the debris. But as I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the boardroom window, I didn't see a queen. I saw a woman who had spent 30 years being a foundation, and now that the building was gone, I didn't know what it felt like to just be the ground.
"What's next?"
Marcus asked softly. I looked at the city below, the millions of lives, the millions of secrets. "Next," I said, "I'm going to go to a hotel. I'm going to order a cup of coffee. And I'm going to make sure it's the most expensive roast they have. Not because I need it, but because for the first time in my life, I don't have to ask if I'm worth the price." But as I stood up to leave, my phone vibrated. It was a text from an unknown number. "Mom. Julian is in the hospital. He crashed the car. They say he was erratic. They're asking for insurance information, and the card was declined. Please. He's your son." I looked at the message. I looked at the black screen of the boardroom. The emotional labor of being a mother was the one debt you could never truly liquidate. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and filtered air, a scent that always reminded me of the time I spent waiting for Julian to be born, the hours of hope and physical agony that I had mistakenly thought would bind us forever. Now, walking through the sliding glass doors in my charcoal suit, the clicking of my heels on the linoleum sounded like a countdown. Silas followed a few paces behind, his phone already pressed to his ear, quietly arranging for a private floor and a security detail. He knew I didn't want a circus. I just wanted the truth. I found Chloe in the waiting area of the trauma ward. She looked small, tucked into a vinyl chair that seemed to swallow her silk dress. Her makeup was smeared, and her hair, usually a masterpiece of precision, was matted at the back. When she saw me, she didn't stand up. She just stared, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "They won't admit him to the private wing," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I gave them the family insurance card, and the computer it flashed red. They said the policy was terminated an hour ago. Mom, how can it be terminated? Dad said we were covered for life." "The policy was tied to the Vance Logistics executive package, Chloe," I said, my voice steady and cool. "The board terminated that package the moment your father was removed, along with the corporate credit cards and the lease on the cars." Chloe's mouth hung open. "But Julian is hurt. He's in there with a possible concussion and a broken leg. You can't just let him sit in a public ward. It's filthy. There are people shouting. It's not where he belongs." "He belongs exactly where his own resources can take him," I said. I looked past her to the triage desk, where a tired nurse was filing paperwork. "Did the police come?" "They're in the hallway," Chloe said, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. "They said Julian was driving 80 in a 45. He hit a retaining wall. They found a bottle of scotch in the passenger seat." "Dad's scotch, Mom. The expensive stuff." I felt a weary, familiar weight settle in my chest. Julian hadn't crashed because of the business or the money. He had crashed because he didn't know how to exist in a world where he wasn't the protagonist. He had tried to drink away the realization that he was a secondary character in a story I was finally writing. "Stay here," I told Chloe. I walked toward the police officers. They were young, their uniforms crisp, looking at a place in the chaotic hum of the ER. I introduced myself not as Julian's mother, but as the principal of Crestwood. I watched their posture change the moment Silas stepped forward and handed them a business card that practically hummed with legal authority. "We aren't looking to obstruct," Silas said smoothly,
But we are interested in the vehicle's black box data. We believe the driver may have been under extreme emotional distress caused by recent corporate developments. "He was a mess, ma'am," one of the officers said, looking at me with a touch of pity. "Kept screaming that he was a billionaire and that he'd have our badges. Then he started crying for his mother." I looked through the small glass window of the treatment room. Julian was strapped to a gurney, a cervical collar around his neck. He looked pale, his face scratched by glass. He looked like the boy I had tucked into bed for 20 years, and yet he looked like a complete stranger. I went inside. The doctor, a harried woman with dark circles under her eyes, looked up from Julian's chart. "Are you the mother?" she asked. "I am," I said. "He's stable. He has a compound fracture in his right tibia and a moderate concussion. He'll need surgery for the leg. We're waiting on insurance authorization before we move him to the OR." She said it so simply. Insurance authorization. The barrier between my son's pain and its resolution was a series of numbers in a computer. Numbers I controlled. Julian's eyes fluttered open.
He saw me, and for a second, the entitlement vanished. He looked terrified. "Mom?" "I'm here, Julian," I said, staying by the door. I didn't rush to his side. I didn't take his hand. The distance between us was the 30 years I had spent being his safety net, only to be treated like a footstool. "Mom, tell them who we are," he wheezed, wincing as he tried to move. "They're treating me like a nobody. They won't even give me the good meds until the card clears. Fix it. Please, just fix it like you always do." "I'm not fixing it, Julian," I said softly. He blinked, confusion clouding his gaze. "What?" "Mom, I'm hurting. I'm really hurting." "I know you are. And for the first time in your life, you're going to feel the full weight of your own choices. You stole your father's car. You drove intoxicated. You destroyed property. These are your actions, Julian, not mine." "But you have the money!" he shouted, his voice cracking into a sob. "Chloe told me. You own everything. Why are you doing this to me? Do you hate me that much?" "I don't hate you, Julian. I'm just tired. I'm tired of paying for a life you refuse to respect. I will authorize the surgery. I will ensure you have the best medical care available. But I will not be paying for your legal defense. And I will not be posting your bail when the police process your arrest." Julian's face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You bitch. You've been sitting on all that money while I struggled. You watched me fail and you did nothing? You're not a mother. You're a monster." I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. The word monster didn't hurt. It felt like a promotion. If being a mother meant being a silent, exploited servant, then I was happy to be something else. "The surgery is authorized," I told the doctor, ignoring Julian's screaming. "Move him to the private wing. I'll settle the bill personally. But please inform the police that once he is medically cleared, he is to be treated like any other citizen." I walked out of the room. Chloe was waiting in the hall, her eyes searching mine. "Is he okay?" she asked. "He'll live," I said. "He's going into surgery." "Thank God," she exhaled, leaning against the wall. I thought you were really going to leave him there." "Now, about my apartment, Mom. The landlord called. He said the grant payment was reversed. I told him it was a mistake, that my mother would take care of it." I stopped and looked at her. Really looked at her. She was already moving on to her own needs, her own tragedies. Julian was in surgery, and she was worried about her zip code. "Chloe," I said, my voice like ice, "I am not your mother tonight. I am your landlord, your financier, and the woman who is currently deciding whether or not to let you spend the night on the street." Chloe's face went white. "Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your daughter." "And I was your housekeeper 2 days ago," I reminded her. "The apartment is gone. The studio lease is being liquidated. If you want a place to stay, you can go to the house and help the movers. Your father is being evicted in 48 hours. I suggest you pack anything that actually belongs to you, which, as it turns out, is very little." I walked toward the exit. Silas was waiting with the car door open. The night air was sharp, biting through the fabric of my suit. "Where to, Elena?" Silas asked. I looked back at the hospital, at the glowing windows of the ward where my son lay cursing my name, and my daughter stood wondering where her life had gone. I had spent my life building a fortress for them, and all they had done was use the stones to pelt me. "The hotel, Silas," I said, "and call the foreman at the estate. I want the locks changed by dawn. Arthur is still in the study. I want him out before the sun hits the driveway. And if he refuses, then tell him the principal is coming," I said, sliding into the back seat, "and she isn't bringing any coffee." As the car pulled away, I looked at my hands. They were steady. But as I closed my eyes, I could still hear Julian's voice calling me a monster. I wondered how long it would take for the silence to feel like peace instead of a void. The hotel suite was a cavern of beige silk and silent air, perched 40 floors above the city. For the first time in 35 years, I didn't have to check the burner on the stove or wonder if the back door was locked. I didn't have to listen for the heavy, rhythmic tread of Arthur's footsteps or the sharp, demanding ring of Julian's voice from the basement. The silence was absolute, yet it felt heavy, like a garment that was slightly too large for me. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, a porcelain cup of Blue Mountain coffee in my hand. It was the expensive roast Arthur had demanded. It was rich, complex, and tasted exactly like the autonomy I had been denied for decades. I watched the sunrise bleed across the horizon, turning the skyscrapers into shards of amber. My phone vibrated on the marble side table. It was a live feed from the security cameras at the estate. Silas had given me access to the owner's portal, a digital eye into the world I was dismantling. On the screen, a white van was pulled up to the front circle. 2 men in gray uniforms were standing by the limestone pillars, waiting. At 6:01 a.m., Arthur emerged from the front door. He was still wearing his silk bathrobe, his hair a chaotic nest of silver. He was waving a piece of paper, likely the forged loan document or a printed copy of his now defunct employment contract, at the movers. I watched him mouth words I couldn't hear. He looked frantic, a small, pale figure against the grandeur of the house I had bought for him. Then, Silas stepped into the frame. He was dressed in a charcoal overcoat, looking like a grim reaper in bespoke tailoring. He handed Arthur a folder. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was being said. Silas was informing him that the house was no longer a Vance residence. It was a Crestwood asset, and as of 60 seconds ago, Arthur Vance was a trespasser. I stood up, smoothed the front of my suit, and drained the rest of my coffee. It was time to go home one last time. By the time the car pulled into the driveway of the estate, the scene had shifted from frantic to funereal. Chloe's car was parked haphazardly on the lawn, and she was on the porch, clutching a designer garment bag as if it were a life raft. Arthur was sitting on his expensive leather suitcase at the foot of the stairs, his head in his hands. The movers were already bringing out the first of the furniture. the heavy mahogany pieces Arthur had insisted on to project gravitas. When my car door opened, the silence that fell over the driveway was physical. Arthur looked up, his face a map of ruin. Chloe took a step toward me, then stopped, cowed by the presence of the two security guards who had stepped out of the lead vehicle. "Elena?" Arthur rasped, standing up. He looked decades older than he had 24 hours ago. The bathrobe was stained with coffee. "You can't do this. There are laws. There is a process." "The process is complete, Arthur," I said, walking toward the porch. I didn't look at the furniture being hauled away. I looked at the house. The limestone looked cold in the morning light. "Silas served the eviction notice last night. The corporate lease was tied to your performance. You were terminated for cause. The cause being fraud, embezzlement, and a catastrophic failure of leadership." "I'm your husband," he yelled, his voice cracking. "We raised a family here. You're going to throw your daughter onto the street? Look at her, Elena. She has nowhere to go." I looked at Chloe. She was staring at me with a mixture of terror and a budding, ugly resentment. "Chloe is 34 years old, Arthur. She is an adult who has spent the last decade mocking my small life while living in a studio I paid for. She has a business. She has merit, as she told me. Let's see her use it." "Mom, please," Chloe sobbed, dropping the garment bag. "I don't have any money in my personal account. Julian's legal fees? The hospital said you authorized the surgery, but the billing department told me you haven't signed the long-term care agreement. They're going to move him to a county facility for rehab." "Then he will go to rehab at a county facility," I said. "He'll be in the company of people who have survived much worse than a broken leg and a bruised ego." I climbed the steps and stood at the front door. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old brass key I had carried for 30 years. It was the only key I had ever been allowed to have, the back door key. Arthur had always kept the front door remote in his car. I handed the brass key to the foreman of the moving crew. "Change the locks on all the service entrances first, then the main gates. Anything that isn't on the inventory list Silas gave you, Arthur's clothes, his personal trophies, his scotch, put it in the van. If it's on the list, it stays. The art, the rugs, the silver, it all belongs to Crestwood." "Elena, wait!" Arthur scrambled up the steps, but a security guard stepped into his path. "That desk in the study, it was my father's." "Your father died in debt, Arthur," I said, turning to face him. "I bought that desk at an estate auction 30 years ago to save you the embarrassment of losing it. I've been the one who owned your history all along. You were just the one who sat behind it." Arthur's face crumpled. He sank to his knees on the stone porch, the silk of his robe catching on the grout. It was a pathetic sight. The titan of Vance Logistics, reduced to a man begging for a desk in a house that didn't know his name. I felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a distant, echoic memory of the woman who would have knelt beside him, the woman who would have offered him a cup of tea and a way out. I looked for her in the corners of my mind, but the room was empty. That woman had been evicted a long time ago. "Mom, what about me?" Chloe asked, her voice small and trembling. "Where do I go?" "You have the car I bought you, Chloe," I said. "And you have the clothes on your back. Beyond that, I suggest you find a friend who values your company more than your connections. Though, I suspect that might be a short list." I walked into the house. The foyer was a skeleton of its former self. The rugs were rolled up, the mirrors covered in bubble wrap. It looked like a crime scene. I walked to the kitchen. On the counter sat my chipped mug.
the one I had used every morning while they ignored me. One of the movers had moved it aside to make room for a packing crate. I picked it up. It felt cold. I walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, and watched the water swirl down the drain. For 30 years, I had washed their dishes, scrubbed their floors, and cleaned up the messes of their lives. I had been the invisible glue. I let the mug slip from my fingers. It shattered against the marble floor with a sharp, final crack. A spray of white ceramic shards skittered across the stone. I didn't feel a surge of joy. I didn't feel a rush of revenge. I just felt a profound, echoing lightness. The last thread was broken. I walked out of the kitchen, through the hollowed-out living room, and out the front door. I didn't look at Arthur, who was now being escorted toward the white van. I didn't look at Chloe, who was sitting on the curb, staring at her phone. I got into the back of my sedan. "The hospital, Silas," I said.
To see Julian? No, I said, looking out the window as we passed the gates of the estate for the last time. To settle the bill. I want to make sure my name is removed from the records entirely. From now on, if they want to find me, they'll have to do it without using my resources. As the car accelerated, I realized I hadn't cried. Not once. I wondered if that was the true definition of a bankrupt soul. Not a soul without money, but a soul that had finally run out of tears to give to people who only knew how to take. My phone chimed. A news alert. Vance Logistics CEO ousted amid fraud allegations. Crestwood Holdings steps in. I turned the phone off. I didn't need to read the news. I was finally the one making it. The hospital room was quiet. The only sound the rhythmic wheeze of the heart monitor. Julian lay there, his legs suspended in a complex rig of metal and pulleys. He looked small, stripped of the expensive Italian cotton and the bravado that usually acted as his armor. When I stepped into the room, he didn't yell. He didn't call me a bitch. He just looked at me with a hollow, desperate hope. "Mom," he whispered. "The nurses said the private insurance is gone. They're moving me to the state wing at noon. Please, I can't go there. It's not for people like me." "You're right, Julian," I said, standing at the foot of his bed. I didn't sit down. "It's for people who have no one left to pay their way. And as of this morning, you are one of them." "I'm your son," he choked out, a tear tracking through the dried blood on his cheek. "You were a project I poured my life into," I corrected him. "But every investor knows when to cut their losses. I've paid for your surgery. You'll walk again. What you do with those legs is no longer my concern." I laid a single envelope on his bedside table. It wasn't a check. It was a bus ticket to a town 3 states away where I owned a small, modest warehouse. "There's a job there. Entry level. Loading docks. If you show up, you'll have a wage. If you don't, you'll have the street. The choice is finally yours." I walked out before he could respond, the sound of his sobbing fading behind the heavy swinging doors. I drove back to the estate one last time. The white van was gone. The house stood silent, a limestone ghost in the fading afternoon light. Arthur was still there, sitting on his suitcase by the gate, looking like a man who had been dropped into a foreign country without a map. He stood up as my car approached, his eyes wild. "Elena, wait!" he shouted, running to the driver's side window as I slowed down. "I found the old files, in the attic. The original incorporation papers for Vance Logistics. My father's signature. It's not there. I don't understand. It says the company was founded by a E.R. Miller in 1985. That's your maiden name, Elena. Miller. I rolled down the window just an inch. The air smelled of damp earth and the end of something long. You always wondered how I had so much money to save you, Arthur, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. You spent 35 years telling me I married into your legacy. You told our children they were Vances and that Vances were born to rule. But you forgot one very small detail about the day we met. Arthur's hand trembled against the glass. What? I didn't marry into your company, Arthur. I hired you to run mine. The blood drained from his face. He staggered back, his mouth opening in a silent O of realization. You were a mid-level manager with a silver tongue and a decent suit, I continued, the truth finally finding the air. I was 26, a billionaire heiress who wanted to see if I could build a life that wasn't defined by my father's shadow. I gave you a name. I gave you a seat at the head of the table. I even took your last name to make the lie easier for you to swallow. I wanted to be a wife. I wanted to be a mother. I wanted to see if love was real when the money was invisible. You lied to me for 30 years? He whispered. No, I said. I gave you a 30-year performance review, and you failed, Arthur. You failed the moment you started believing the lie was your own truth. You failed the moment you treated the woman who built your world like the dirt beneath it. I looked at the house, the mansion he thought was his birthright. The demolition crew arrives tomorrow, I said. I'm turning this lot into a public park. No one will ever remember that a Vance lived here. Elena, please, he begged, reaching for the door handle. Where am I supposed to go? I have nothing. You have exactly what you brought into this marriage, Arthur, I said. A silver tongue and a decent suit. I suggest you start walking. I hear there's a bus station 5 miles down the road. I rolled up the window, the thick glass sealing out his screams, his pleas, and the pathetic sound of his fists thumping against the door. I looked in the rearview mirror as I drove away. He was a small, diminishing speck of gray against the vast green horizon. The bankrupt housewife was gone. As I drove toward the city, I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small blue passport. I opened it. It didn't say Elena Vance. It said Elena Miller. I looked at the photo. The woman in the picture wasn't smiling, but her eyes were clear. She looked like someone who had just woken up from a very long, very expensive dream. I picked up my phone and dialed Silas. Silas, I said, cancel the hotel. Book me a flight to Tuscany. One way. And the Vance accounts, Elena? Close them, I said. Every last one. I want the balance to be exactly 0. Let them see what it actually feels like to be bankrupt. I hung up and turned off the phone. For the first time in 35 years, the silence didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a beginning. I was no longer the foundation. I was the sky.